What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Funnel Vision Show, where we interview some of the smartest, brightest marketers, agency owners, people who just like to make money online and drive traffic and convert it into customers. We pick their brains and understand how they do what they do. And today is no exception. We have John Cogan, who is a 20-year veteran in the agency space, has built his own agency, has coached agencies, has also worked with some of the biggest brands in the higher level agencies. So we get a breadth of information over the next 20 minutes. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I'm excited to chat with you. I'm excited to dive into the correlations between kind of the bigger agencies versus starting that agency and what you can pass from those learnings. But as we do with the Funnel Vision Show, every episode always starts with your not so humble bragging rights. So in other words, what have you been able to do for your clients? What have you done as a business? How would your mother brag about you, in other words, to everybody?
I don't know how to answer it in the context of that last part, but in terms of what I've done, I guess for clients, I think it comes down to being I would say a source of calm amidst the storm or amidst the chaos, and more than calm, a source of focus and a little bit of ruthlessness, I would say, which is much easier from the outside looking in. And I've now experienced that as an entrepreneur. The last year and a half or so launching my own business, it's a lot easier to talk to somebody else about their brand and to bring focus and to really prioritize and crystallize and really get down to what matters most than it is when it's your own business, which again, the reason why agencies and partners can be so valuable. So I think that's, if anything, that's what it's been. It's around cutting the noise and cutting through the noise, I should say, and bringing a sense of focus and really an unwavering sense of commitment to what matters most, which ultimately at the end of the day, through repetition and consistency, there's a return on that focus. And I think that's when I think about the common thread between different campaigns or brands I've been involved with, whether it's a launch or revitalization, that seems to be the common thread. It's bringing that sense of focus and then just being unwavering and committed to whatever that focus is, as opposed to trying to throw a bunch of darts at the wall and do everything at once.
So tell me a little bit about your journey and what you do what you've done on the large agency side. Walk us through what that looked like and where you're at now.
Yeah. So it started my career with a relatively small independent agency and worked my way through from a pretty linear perspective in terms of not only as I grew in the organizations, but also into bigger and bigger agencies. And that happened to go in a pretty linear path for the first 20 years. So for the first 10 or so, I was independent, then kind of part of the network world in the health and wellness space, a lot of pharmaceutical, but also consumer health tech and personal care. And then the last 4 years was with VP leading Tank Worldwide's Toronto operation, which was a great opportunity to spread a little bit of my entrepreneurial wing within an established infrastructure. So a bit of a soft launch into the world of entrepreneurship for me. And that was a great experience. And again, we can talk to what are the strengths and perils of being part of the massive global network. I think there's a lot to take away from that, from a system and rigor and operational structure standpoint, that I think is incredibly valuable. I think even in terms of elevating creativity, that having that kind of structure and guardrail, I think, is a catalyst to creativity more so than the blank canvas, anything goes approach in a lot of cases. So I think that's what I've taken away on the positive. On the flip side, I definitely see in the network world, and now the last year and a half being back, starting my own agency and consultancy and working with a number of other independent agencies, I'm seeing again in a refreshing way the value of, again, focusing on the process and focusing on what makes an agency tick as opposed to the end result or the outcome. I think it's easy to get caught up and hard to avoid getting caught up in the network world, this kind of outcomes, short-term focus. We come up with a forecast sometime in the mid to late part of a year. And while it's not exactly, call it an educated guess, suddenly that becomes our North Star. And a lot of decisions get made based on achieving, meeting, or trying to exceed that forecast, as opposed to doing what's right for the business, whether it's investment, divesting, making decisions that make sense strategically. And I find it's so difficult to avoid getting caught up in some of that short-term like I said, outcomes focused that I think is detrimental to the growth and success of an agency. I think it's Mischief, whose motto is, if we focus on what makes us special, the money will follow. And if we focus on the money, we'll stop being special. And forgive me if I butchered the quote a little, but I think to me, that's a bang on philosophy when it comes to agency growth. Whatever it is that makes each agency special, I think needs to be the focus as opposed to what that target number might be for a month or a quarter. And I found that to me was the biggest takeaway coming back now to starting my own business, that it's got to be about focusing on the process and the behaviors that will ultimately lead to success, as opposed to worrying about that next target, if there is a target, or that next outcome.
It's interesting seeing the correlation between that, right? Like when you kind of work in this network of agencies, you realize, oh man, okay, they've got stuff together, or at least on the surface, it looks like on the surface, it appears that they got stuff together. Do they have all their stuff together when you actually lift the hood?
To be fair, I don't think anybody really does. But so if you lift up the hood, the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. But the reality is that every agency is a business, and most, if not all, are for-profit businesses, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think in the network world, there's a lot more structure and a lot more focus on efficiency first. And in my opinion, that may be the best way to sum up the challenges. There's so many strengths, and ultimately, like anything, it comes down to the quality of the people, and the thinking. But I think in advertising and in marketing, and I think probably in business in general, if you focus on effectiveness, on doing things really well, you tend to be more efficient. You tend to do it the first time. You deliver what you're promising or what the business requires the first time around, and ultimately the overall project, becomes not only effective but more efficient. Sometimes I found more so in the network world, where there's a bit more of that kind of corporate focus, the focus becomes efficiency first. And like I said, outcomes first. And do we have enough people putting enough time in their timesheets? But then at the same time, do we have people not going overtime on projects? And there's this kind of contradictory focus at times on trying to tier the efficiency factors, as opposed to just saying, let's do the best possible job. Because if we do that, at the end of the day, this project's not going to go off the rails. Clients are going to be happy. We're going to deliver relatively timely. We're going to deliver what they need. And we're not going to have to redo the work 3-4 times, which is what really ends up causing a lot of the overages and the inefficiencies. So that's something I think definitely in the last half of my career, that's been a huge focus, that if we want efficiency, focus on the effectiveness first, the efficiency will follow. And I think the mistake some businesses make, and this isn't unique to advertising, is the focus is on the efficiencies first, and then the effectiveness suffers.
And that's, I think, now that you have started your agency and your business and you coach, and you see that it's the flip side, right? You grow, you make a lot of money, you start hiring a whole bunch of team members, and it's like on the surface, everything looks great, but inside it's chaos because there's no efficiencies, there's no real systems. It's just people and projects and deliver and growth, versus where do you find is the best place to start focusing on those efficiencies, on those systems? Because if you start too soon and you don't have the growth, then it becomes redundant, and then you have too much overhead and all of that stuff. So where's that sweet spot from your experience?
So I think the interesting part is, I think most of the larger agencies do have systems. They're not always perfect, and they're in need of constant kind of tinkering and constant improvement and introspection. But the difference becomes, the larger you get, humans are humans, and you're going to have teams that are really effective and great, and teams that aren't as effective and aren't as great. And that can be at the individual level, the team level, in terms of camaraderie and structure or lack thereof. So it's not, the bigger an agency gets, that agency is no longer one thing. It really depends on the people and the teams involved. Especially you talk about the larger agencies with thousands of people globally, you could ask 20 clients what it's like to work with that agency, and you're going to get 20 different answers, versus a smaller independent where, generally speaking, the culture and the camaraderie and the team is what it is. So I think I think it's difficult. What I'm about to say is easy to say in theory, difficult to put into practice. And that's, the more you can uphold a set of standards as you grow, and it's how big can you get before you start to dilute your quality. That to me becomes the key to growth. Now, some agencies are able to grow on their reputation and deliver, I don't want to say mediocrity, but deliver a solid product coupled with reliability and scale, and that works. I think if the goal is to really grow and to maintain a level of excellence, it's growing at the right pace so that you can actually attract the quality of people and the quality of ideas that you need to keep that level of excellence. Because again, and this is so cliched, but it's true, it is just a people business. And while you can ask 20 agencies what makes them unique, and I always laugh because you only get maybe 2 or 3 answers, which that means they're not all that unique. What ultimately makes them unique, yeah, there's some different ways of approaching business and unique perspectives and approaches and processes. That all is important. But ultimately, are the people smart and curious and creative and collaborative and all those positive qualities, and that's going to bring out the best work.
So walk me through where in your journey you got to this tipping point of, okay, I'm gone through this process of working in these bigger agencies, these bigger brands with multiple divisions and multiple sister companies and all that stuff, to then, you know what, we're going to shift and we're going to go and start our own and also ultimately help other agencies?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I guess the imposter syndrome never fully goes away, but there's a fine line between, I started in the agency world at age 23 and I'm now 44. There is no particular day where the switch flips and you become the old person as opposed to the young one. So that's a very gradual thing, but it happens. And so there's obviously a confidence that comes with the experience and the seniority. But I think more so than that, my first agency experience, our CEO and owner, someone I still am in touch with, was also a marketing professor and was a marketer on the client side first. And so he hammered home and continues to hammer home kind of the marketing fundamentals, the importance of that in every situation, starting with positioning and really focusing on direction and having a solid foundation. And I think that served me well to even up to today. It's my focus now because that never changes. Like, that's held. And I think the tipping point for me was coming to that realization that so many people struggle to remember that never changes, whether we're etching a message into stone or leveraging, doing a podcast like this or using some other form of modern technology. The fundamentals are the fundamentals. We're trying to connect with people in a certain way and reach them or persuade them in a certain way. And that's always going to be the same. And then the other challenge that I think was a tipping point for me, or not challenge, but the other realization, was the fact that it's, like I said earlier, it's so hard to maintain objectivity and perspective from inside. The cliche is you can't read the label from inside the jar. And so I think there's incredible value in bringing an outside perspective and bringing the benefit of a bunch of different outside perspectives, because in the agency world, we get to touch all kinds of different businesses and deal with parallel challenges. So bringing that to the table is hugely valuable. And I think most business owners recognize, and brand owners recognize, the value in that having an outside perspective and a partner who is not as immersed in the business as they are day to day is helpful. And it also allows for a little more kind of ruthlessness when it comes to having to prioritize and say no and focus on doing fewer things.
I think it's a very good point that you bring up when it comes to just understanding how to prioritize and being able to, I think the analogy you said is reading the label from inside the jar itself is impossible and at least very difficult. And I think a lot of times you have to step out of that jar, but when you're running your business, you're always in that jar. If we keep going with this jar analogy here, having those different perspectives, having people come in really does help. So tell me, from your standpoint, what are the best types of people to bring in to help you with those perspectives? What should you be thinking about getting perspective on?
I think people who aren't afraid to disagree and say no and have the conviction of their own point of view, or the courage of their own conviction, I should say. That's easy to say, hard to do. And we're all guilty at times of massaging what we're saying, depending on who we're, our audience, etc. But I think having the kind of, like I said, conviction to express an opinion, and then knowing that person is always going to do that in a way that's constructive and comes from an honest place, I think is incredibly valuable. And then the ability, like I said, to be able to zoom in and zoom out. And I think a lot of people talk about, I know throughout the agency world, you have a lot of people saying, I want to get involved in the strategy. I want to be involved in this on the strategy planning side. And I always say, you are, if you're doing your job well. Strategy is not a one-time planning session or being in some, dark room where you come up with a big idea. It really is just a daily ability to understand what we're trying to accomplish, and then to also understand if are we doing things that are leading us towards accomplishing that. It's very simple. And so being able to zoom in and out in terms of, okay, what are we doing today and right now? And then zoom back out to, is this serving what we're ultimately trying to achieve? That, to me, that strategic perspective is something that, again, when you're in the jar, to stick with the analogy, is hard to maintain. So being able to have that, we're zoomed in today and we're focused on this one task, but we also have the conceptual perspective in terms of where we are on the broader journey. I think that's also crucial.
It's a very good point that you brought up. So how would you summarize this into a playbook if you could? What does that look like? A 5-step framework or a 3-step framework? What would that look like?
It's a good question. I think obviously would need more thought, but off the top of my head, I think it always starts with, okay, who is it that what are we trying to achieve and for whom or with whom? And so really understanding who it is we're trying to connect to and what it is they're currently doing versus what we're currently not only doing, but currently feeling and thinking. And then what it is we're trying to get them to think, feel, and do. So it starts with that. And then again, it comes down to finding that focus and then understanding, okay, ultimately, what do we have to do in a very simple way to get them from current to desired or future? And then the sub bullets. What are the steps involved in doing that? And how do we know if it's working or not at each stage? So super simple, but it's breaking down each of those components. Again, that's just marketing strategy 101, but breaking all that down into kind of the simplest possible terms, because there really isn't, it's complicated and it's difficult to do this well, but none of it should feel complex or confusing in the moment. I think good marketing and good strategy and even good creativity, when you see it, should feel obvious and feel, yeah, that makes sense. It shouldn't be confusing or overly complex. So I think if I was to develop a playbook, it would be about how to uncover that simplicity, but also how to maintain that focus. And I think there's a return on that focus. The more focused you are, the more you're going to get the attention that you need in order to broaden the story later on. So I think focus is, to me, the number one. If I was to develop a book or a playbook, that would be a theme for sure. And it's easy for me to say that. It's not, I'm like anyone else. It's hard especially when it comes to my own business, it's hard to stay focused and to do one thing, but it's certainly important.
No, I agree. It's very difficult to stay hyper focused when you're trying to do a lot of things all at once, for sure. And because we're wrapping up here and we're coming up to the end of the episode, one of the things we always ask all of our guests, because it's something that is fascinating to me. We are marketers at the end of the day. We love shiny tactics with the best new tactics. What is your best growth tactic that is your go-to? It will work for any business. What's your best growth tactic that you can share?
Okay, so I think there's a whole bunch of pretty standard answers that would all apply and they'd all be on the list. To me, ultimately, clients are going to forget most of the details. They're going to remember, did you add stress to their life or did you reduce stress? Did you take it off the table? And ultimately, you want to be a stress reducer, so that to me is the number one growth tactic. Now, that's an outcome. How do you become a stress reducer? I think it's about listening. It's about communicating clearly and frequently, and then being reliable and delivering and just attacking problems as they come up and solving them. So I know that's a bunch of things, but ultimately being reliable is the number one growth tactic, in my opinion, because it leads to that stress reduction, that, hey, I can sleep at night feeling from the client, which 2 years later, when the next opportunity comes along or they're asked to recommend someone, that's what they're going to go back to. They're not going to remember, again, all of the details of how good the work was or what awards it won or any of that stuff. They're going to remember, you know what, I could sleep at night when I was working with that agency or those people. So I recommend them.
That's you know what, you'd be surprised how few people have said the same growth tactic in all of the episodes that and this is a new one, right? Be a stress reducer is a great growth tactic. It's a great way to think about how to position your services and how to really put yourself in a position where you're no longer a commodity, but in fact, you're actually there to really provide value by reducing stress, which is
I think what we all want.
What we all want: less stress, more happier lives. So, John, I appreciate you sharing all this. Where can people learn more about you?
LinkedIn. I think I'm under Jonathan Cogan on LinkedIn, no H, but I guess we'll throw my link down there. And finally, we'll be launching my website, .ca, later this month. But for now, find me on LinkedIn and I'd love to connect.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on, and we appreciate you, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks so much, Mikhail. Appreciate it.